You were not born to dream small. You were trained to, from your earliest lessons, from the quiet discipline of the classroom to the unspoken rules of the workplace, from the praise given for obedience to the punishment reserved for defiance. Your imagination was measured, trimmed, and confined. You were told to be realistic, to be practical, to be grateful. You were warned against wanting too much, questioning too deeply, demanding too boldly. But who defines what is too much? The ruling class does. The same class that owns the factories, the banks, the land, the media, and the machinery of thought. The same class that profits from your labor while preaching humility to your hunger. The same class that calls its greed enterprise and your survival ambition. You were taught to dream small because large dreams threaten large fortunes. Under capitalism, your dreams must fit the market. Your passions must be profitable. Your education must be employable. Your time must be sellable. Your worth must be measurable in wages. And so you are told, dream of a job, not ownership of the means of production. Dream of promotion, not liberation. Dream of stability, not transformation. Dream of private success, not collective power. This is no accident. This is ideology. The dominant ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class. They seep into textbooks, into advertisements, into entertainment, into the very language you use to describe yourself. They teach you that poverty is personal failure, that wealth is moral virtue, that competition is natural, that inequality is inevitable. But inequality is not a law of nature. It is a structure of power. Capitalism does not merely exploit your labor, it colonizes your imagination. It convinces the worker that the highest aspiration is to become a better servant of capital. It trains you to measure success not by freedom, but by proximity to those who dominate you. You are taught to celebrate the rare individual who makes it, so you will not question why the system requires millions to fail. Consider the worker who rises before dawn, who gives 8, 10, 12 hours of life to a machine, a desk, a screen. The value he creates exceeds his wage. The surplus flows upward, into dividends, into speculation, into empires. Yet he is told to dream of overtime, to dream of a slightly higher wage, to dream of one day escaping the very condition that defines him. This is the cunning genius of capitalism. It transforms systemic exploitation into personal aspiration. Instead of asking why the fruits of collective labor are privately owned, you are encouraged to ask how you might one day join the owners. But the system is not built for universal ownership. It is built for concentration. Capital accumulates, wealth centralizes, power consolidates, the many labor, the few command. And so long as you dream alone, you remain weak. The worker who dreams individually competes with other workers. He sees his fellow laborer not as an ally, but as a rival. He is divided by race, by nationality, by religion, by gender, divisions carefully cultivated to obscure the real line of conflict, the line between those who own and those who work. Class struggle is not a slogan. It is the hidden engine of history. From feudal lord and serf to capitalist and proletarian, every epoch is marked by antagonism between oppressor and oppressed. And in our time, the antagonism is global. The factory worker in one nation, the delivery driver in another, the farmer crushed by debt, the graduate chained to loans. All are bound by the same relation to capital. They sell their labor to survive, and yet they are told to dream small. Dream of individual escape instead of collective emancipation. Dream of consumer comforts instead of structural change. Dream of temporary relief instead of permanent transformation. Why? because a worker who dreams of liberation becomes dangerous. When the working class begins to see itself not as scattered individuals, but as a unified force, when it recognizes that its poverty is not accidental but engineered, when it understands that its labor sustains the entire social order, then the foundation of capitalism trembles. For what is capital without labor? Nothing. No machine turns, no commodity circulates, no profit emerges, no empire expands. The entire system rests upon the living labor of the proletariat, and yet the proletariat is taught to see itself as powerless. This is the greatest illusion. You are told the market is natural, as inevitable as gravity. But markets are made, laws are written, property rights are enforced. Police protect ownership before humanity. The state, which claims neutrality, stands guard over the interests of capital, and still you are told, dream small, work hard, be patient. But patience has built palaces for others while you rent your own survival. The truth is this: your dreams were disciplined because your potential is revolutionary. If workers everywhere demanded not higher wages, but control over production, the system would be forced to transform. If the oppressed refused to internalize the limits imposed upon them, those limits would crack. Revolution does not begin with weapons. It begins with consciousness. It begins when you reject the lie that your suffering is personal failure, when you recognize exploitation not as destiny, but as design, when you see that the wealth of society is collectively produced and therefore must be collectively owned. To dream big under capitalism is to dream beyond capitalism. It is to imagine a society in which production serves human need, not private profit, in which technology liberates workers instead of displacing them, in which education cultivates critical thought rather than obedient employees, in which the full development of each is the condition for the full development of all. Such a dream terrifies those who rule, because they know that history does not stand still. They know that systems built on exploitation contain the seeds of their own dissolution. They know that when the exploited class becomes conscious of its power, it ceases to be merely a class in itself and becomes a class for itself. So I say to you, refuse the smallness imposed upon your imagination. Refuse the narrow horizon offered to you as realism. Refuse the morality that praises submission and condemns resistance. Study the structure that binds you. Organize with those who share your condition. Build solidarity across every artificial boundary designed to divide you. For the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. No savior will descend from the boardroom. No reform gifted from above will dismantle exploitation at its root. Only collective struggle, conscious, organized, relentless, can reclaim the wealth, dignity, and freedom stolen by capital. You were taught to dream small because a dreaming giant is difficult to chain. But chains, however heavy, are forged by human hands, and what is forged can be broken. Dream not of surviving within the system. Dream of transforming it. Dream not as isolated individuals clawing for advantage, but as a united class reclaiming its historic role. For when the workers of the world awaken, when they understand that they are the creators of all value, when they refuse to accept a life reduced to wages and obedience, then the small dreams imposed upon them will dissolve. And in their place will rise something far more powerful, a world built not on exploitation, but on solidarity, not on profit, but on human freedom. Workers of the world do not merely dream. Ideological conditioning does not begin with chains. It begins with lessons. It begins in the quiet repetition of phrases like "be realistic," "know your place," and "that's just how the world works." From childhood, individuals are immersed in a system of thought that defines what is possible and what is absurd, what is ambitious and what is excessive. These limits do not appear as force, they appear as common sense. And common sense, under a class society, is never neutral. In every historical epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. This is not a poetic exaggeration, but a material fact. Those who control the means of material production also control the means of mental production. The institutions that shape consciousness, schools, media, cultural norms, even religious and moral teachings, reflect and reinforce the interests of those who own property and command capital. Through these institutions, the boundaries of ambition are quietly drawn. One is encouraged to aspire, but only within the confines of the existing order. One may dream of rising within the hierarchy, but never of abolishing it. Under capitalism, ambition is carefully redirected. The worker is taught to seek promotion rather than transformation, higher wages rather than ownership, recognition rather than power. The structure itself is treated as sacred and unchangeable. Poverty is framed as a personal shortcoming, wealth as a mark of virtue. In this way, systemic inequality is disguised as individual variation in talent and effort. The exploited are persuaded to blame themselves for conditions that arise from the logic of capital accumulation. This conditioning is subtle because it aligns with daily survival. The worker must sell labor power to live. The need for wages disciplines imagination. Risking dissent threatens livelihood. Questioning the system appears impractical. Thus, necessity reinforces ideology. The limits imposed by material dependence become internal limits on thought. Over time, these constraints harden into beliefs. I cannot change this. No one can change this. It has always been this way. What is historically produced begins to feel natural and eternal. Capitalism further narrows ambition by isolating individuals. Competition is presented as the engine of progress. Workers are pitted against one another for scarce opportunities. In this rivalry, collective solutions appear naive, even dangerous. The dream becomes singular, personal advancement. The possibility of shared emancipation fades from view. Ambition shrinks from a social horizon to a private ladder. Mass culture amplifies this message. Stories celebrate the rare individual who escapes poverty through extraordinary effort. These narratives function as ideological spectacles. They imply that the system works because a few succeed. The countless others who labor without upward mobility are rendered invisible or blamed for insufficient drive. The structural barriers remain untouched, obscured by tales of exceptional ascent. In this way, ambition is simultaneously inflated and constrained. Inflated in fantasy, constrained in reality. Education, too, plays a decisive role. Rather than cultivating critical understanding of economic relations, it often trains individuals to fit into pre-existing roles. Skills are prioritized over analysis, obedience over inquiry. The purpose of learning becomes employability. Knowledge that questions property relations or exposes exploitation is marginalized. Students are prepared to function efficiently within the system, not to interrogate its foundations. The imagination is steered toward career paths, not collective restructuring. Even language reflects ideological limits. Terms like job creator elevate the capitalist, while the worker who generates value through labor is depicted as dependent. Economic crises caused by speculative accumulation are described as unfortunate downturns rather than predictable consequences of profit-driven production. Words, softy, end exploitation, and normalize hierarchy. When language conceals power, ambition adjusts accordingly. The effect of ideological conditioning is not merely psychological, it is political. A population that internalizes limits is less likely to organize. If workers believe that large-scale change is impossible, they will restrict demands to minor reforms. If they perceive inequality as inevitable, they will seek adaptation rather than resistance. The stability of capitalism depends not only on coercive institutions, but on consent shaped by ideology. People comply because alternatives have been rendered unimaginable. Yet ideology is never absolute. Contradictions persist. Workers experience the gap between promise and reality. They see productivity rise while wages stagnate. They witness wealth concentrate in unprecedented proportions. These material conditions generate tensions that ideology struggles to contain. When lived experience conflicts sharply with official narratives, cracks appear in the facade of inevitability. The recognition of ideological conditioning is itself a rupture. To understand that ambition has been shaped by class interests is to reclaim a measure of intellectual autonomy. When workers begin to analyze their position within the relations of production, ambition can expand beyond personal survival. It can shift from competing within the system to questioning the system. Such awareness transforms resignation into critique and critique into potential solidarity. Ideological conditioning limits ambition by defining the horizon of possibility, by presenting historically specific relations as permanent truths, by isolating individuals and redirecting their aspirations toward private gain, by masking exploitation behind narratives of merit and inevitability, and by embedding these assumptions so deeply within daily life that they appear as nature rat, her than power. Capitalism does not merely organize production, it organizes desire. It does not simply extract labor, it shapes aspiration. Within its vast machinery of markets and commodities, it cultivates a particular kind of dream, small, individualized, competitive. It encourages each worker to imagine success as a solitary ascent rather than a collective transformation. In doing so, it converts ambition into fuel for its own expansion. The foundation of capitalism lies in private ownership of the means of production. A minority owns factories, land, technology, capital, while the majority must sell their labor power to survive. This arrangement is inherently unequal, yet it sustains itself not only through economic necessity, but through ideological persuasion. Workers are encouraged to view their condition not as a structural position within a class system, but as a temporary stage in a personal journey. The dream offered to them is not liberation from wage labor, but advancement within it. From the earliest stages of life, individuals are told to distinguish themselves. They are urged to outperform peers, to compete for grades, scholarships, jobs, promotions. Cooperation is praised in theory, but competition determines reward. Success becomes a personal brand. Under such conditions, the worker's imagination is directed toward climbing the existing hierarchy rather than questioning why the hierarchy exists at all. The dream is narrowed to individual mobility. This narrowing is profitable. When workers pursue individualized advancement, they fragment their own collective power. Each seeks to negotiate better terms alone, weakening the possibility of unified resistance. The employer benefits from this division. A workforce divided by ambition is easier to manage than a class united by shared interest. Thus, capitalism cultivates dreams that isolate, consumers see. Culture deepens this pattern. The system produces not only goods, but identities. Advertising teaches individuals to express uniqueness through consumption. One's value appears in possessions, lifestyle, and status symbols. The dream becomes the acquisition of commodities that signal personal success. Rather than seeking control over production, the worker seeks access to products. Desire is redirected from structural change to market participation. Even the narrative of entrepreneurship often functions within this logic. Workers are encouraged to believe that with sufficient effort, they too can become owners. The rare examples of spectacular success are amplified as proof of possibility. Yet the system cannot accommodate universal ownership. It depends on wage labor. For every celebrated entrepreneur, countless others remain employees. The myth of universal ascent disguises the structural necessity of inequality. Small dreams stabilize large profits. When a worker dreams of a slightly higher wage, capitalism can concede marginal increases without altering the fundamental relation of exploitation. When the dream is home ownership financed by debt, the financial sector profits from interest. When the dream is career advancement within a corporation, loyalty to the firm replaces solidarity with fellow workers. Each individualized aspiration binds the worker more tightly to the system that exploits labor. Debt itself becomes a mechanism for sustaining small dreams. Education loans promise future mobility. Mortgages promise security. Credit cards promise immediate consumption. These financial instruments extend access to the symbols of success while deepening dependence on wage labor. The worker must continue selling labor to serve his obligations. In this way, individualized dreams generate long-term revenue streams for capital. Capitalism also commodifies rebellion. Dissatisfaction is anticipated and absorbed into markets. Styles of resistance become fashion trends. Calls for empowerment are repackaged as self-help slogans emphasizing personal improvement over structural critique. The system profits even from the language of dissatisfaction so long as it remains individualized. The focus shifts from collective struggle to personal mindset. The workplace itself reinforces the pattern. Performance metrics rank individuals. Bonuses reward personal output. Promotions separate workers from peers. Under such conditions, solidarity appears risky. To challenge management collectively may threaten individual advancement. The dream of promotion becomes a deterrent to resistance. The employer gains not only labor, but loyalty. Meanwhile, the immense wealth generated by collective labor accumulates in private hands. Surplus value extracted from workers is reinvested to expand production, acquire competitors, influence politics. The concentration of capital grows, yet the narrative of individualized opportunity persists. Workers are invited to identify with billionaires rather than with each other. They are encouraged to imagine themselves as future members of the owning class, however improbable that transformation may be. By narrowing ambition to personal success, capitalism diverts attention from systemic contradiction. The worker striving for promotion has little time to analyze exploitation. The indebted graduate focused on repayment has little space to question property relations. The small business owner struggling to survive may resist regulations that protect labor, believing personal survival depends on cost-cutting. In each case, individualized dreams align behavior with the preservation of capital. The profitability of small dreams lies in their capacity to transform structural discontent into manageable competition. Instead of uniting to demand collective ownership of the means of production, workers compete for incremental advantages. Instead of envisioning a society organized around human need, they pursue recognition within a market system. The energy that might challenge capital is redirected into sustaining it. Thus, capitalism thrives not only on labor, but on imagination shaped to fit its contours, on ambition, disciplined to avoid threatening its foundations, on dreams confined to personal advancement within a structure built upon exploitation, on millions striving alone within a system that depends upon their separation and rewards their competition while converting their hopes into profit. Class struggle is not an abstract theory imposed upon history. It is the living movement beneath it. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, conflicts between those who control the means of production and those who labor within the conditions set by that control. These conflicts are not always visible as open revolt. Often they take the form of negotiations, laws, cultural norms, and silent endurance. Yet beneath every political institution and economic arrangement lies a fundamental antagonism rooted in material interests. In feudal society, the struggle unfolded between lord and serf, structured around land and obligation. In capitalist society, it takes shape between bourgeoisie and proletariat, structured around capital and wage labor. The specific forms evolve, but the underlying dynamic remains. One class extracts surplus from another. This extraction is not merely economic, it shapes the entirety of social life. Law, education, religion, media, and even morality reflect the interests of the dominant class, because the dominant class possesses the material power to shape these institutions. Under capitalism, the bourgeoisie owns factories, technologies, natural resources, and financial instruments. The proletariat owns little beyond labor power. To survive, workers must sell this labor power to those who own capital. In the process of production, workers create value greater than the wages they receive. The difference, the surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This exploitation is the foundation of capitalist accumulation. It is not a deviation or corruption. It is the core mechanism of the system. Because exploitation is embedded in production itself, class struggle permeates everyday life. It appears in disputes over wages, working hours, safety conditions, and job security. It manifests in union organizing and in corporate resistance to unionization. It emerges in legislative battles over labor laws and taxation. Even when conflict is muted, the tension remains. Employers seek to maximize profit by reducing costs. Workers seek to maximize livelihood by increasing compensation and improving conditions. These opposing interests cannot be permanently reconciled within the framework of private ownership. Social reality is therefore not neutral terrain, but a contested field. The state, often presented as an impartial arbiter, functions within this field. While it may mediate conflicts and grant concessions, its structure is shaped by property relations. Laws protecting private ownership are rigorously enforced. Policies that threaten capital accumulation face resistance. Political representation is influenced by wealth and corporate power. Thus, the state becomes an instrument through which the dominant class stabilizes its position, even as it navigates pressures from below. Class struggle also shapes ideology. The dominant class promotes narratives that justify its authority. Success is attributed to merit, poverty to personal failure. Competition is celebrated as natural, cooperation beyond tea. The market is dismissed as unrealistic. These ideas do not arise spontaneously, they are disseminated through institutions funded and influenced by capital. In this way, consciousness itself becomes a site of struggle. Workers may internalize ruling class ideology, but they also generate counter-ideas through shared experience of exploitation. Economic crises further reveal the shaping force of class struggle. Periodic downturns expose contradictions within capitalism: overproduction, underconsumption, speculative bubbles. When crises erupt, the burden is often shifted onto workers through layoffs, wage cuts, and austerity measures. Capital seeks to preserve profitability even at the cost of widespread hardship. Workers resist through strikes and protests, demanding protection and relief. The resolution of crisis reflects the balance of class forces at that historical moment. Globalization extends class struggle across borders. Capital moves freely in search of cheaper labor and higher returns. Workers in different countries are placed in competition, pressured to accept lower wages to attract investment. Yet the underlying relation remains the same. Labor generates value, capital appropriates it. International supply chains connect distant workers within a shared structure of exploitation. Solidarity across national boundaries becomes both more difficult and more necessary. Technological development does not abolish class struggle, it transforms its terrain. Automation can increase productivity, yet the benefits accrue disproportionately to owners of capital. Workers displaced by machines face unemployment or precarious employment. The question arises: who controls technology and for whose benefit is it deployed? This is a class question. The social impact of innovation depends not on the machine itself, but on the property relations governing its use. Cultural lie. Fei too reflects class dynamics. Access to education, healthcare, housing, and leisure is stratified by income and wealth. Urban landscapes are divided between affluence and deprivation. Media representation often normalizes elite lifestyles while marginalizing working-class realities. These patterns are not accidental. They stem from the distribution of resources shaped by class power. At times, class struggle intensifies into open confrontation. Strikes, mass protests, and revolutionary movements erupt when contradictions sharpen and existing institutions fail to contain discontent. In such moments, the latent antagonism becomes explicit. Workers recognize themselves as a collective force capable of reshaping society. The ruling class responds with concessions, repression, or both. The outcome depends on organization, consciousness, and historical conditions. Class struggle shapes social reality because material life shapes consciousness, institutions, and power. The organization of production determines the distribution of wealth. The distribution of wealth influences political authority. Political authority reinforces economic arrangements. This circular reinforcement is sustained by the ongoing contest between classes whose interests diverge fundamentally within the structure of capitalism. Collective consciousness does not arise spontaneously from shared suffering. It emerges from the recognition of shared conditions. Workers may endure exploitation for generations without perceiving themselves as a unified force. They may interpret hardship as personal misfortune rather than structural design. Yet when individuals begin to understand that their struggles are not isolated incidents, but expressions of a common relation to capital, a transformation occurs. The worker ceases to see only a private burden and begins to perceive a collective position within society. Why? Under capitalism, the proletariat is initially a class in itself, defined objectively by its place in the relations of production. Workers sell labor power because they lack ownership of the means of production. This shared economic position exists regardless of awareness. But revolutionary potential remains dormant until the class becomes a class for itself, conscious of its common interests and historical role. This transition from objective condition to subjective awareness is the birth of collective consciousness. Capitalism actively obstructs this development. Competition fragments workers. Differences of race, nationality, religion, and gender are manipulated to divide them. The ideology of individual success encourages identification with the ruling class rather than solidarity with fellow laborers. The media amplifies narratives that glorify isolated achievement while marginalizing collective struggle. In such an environment, workers may perceive one another as rivals rather than allies. Fragmentation weakens resistance and stabilizes the dominance of capital. Yet the very structure of capitalist production fosters the conditions for unity. Workers labor together in factories, offices, warehouses, and digital networks. They depend on cooperation to produce value. The social nature of production stands in contradiction to the private appropriation of profit. This contradiction generates tension. As workers confront shared grievances, long hours, stagnant wages, unsafe conditions, they begin to communicate. In dialogue, they discover commonality. In organization, they recognize strength. Collective consciousness expands through struggle. A strike is not merely an economic tactic, it is an educational experience. When workers withdraw labor collectively, they witness the dependence of capital on their activity. They feel the power that lies in unity. Fear diminishes as solidarity grows. The isolated individual who once felt replaceable now perceives participation in a force capable of halting production. This realization alters perception of social reality. The development of collective consciousness also requires critical understanding. It is not enough to feel anger. One must grasp the structural roots of exploitation. Political education transforms diffuse resentment into coherent analysis. Workers study how surplus value is extracted, how laws protect property, how crises emerge from contradictions within accumulation. This knowledge clarifies that injustice is not accidental, but systemic. It replaces confusion with clarity and passivity with intention. Organizations play a decisive role in sustaining awareness. Trade unions, political movements, and worker assemblies provide spaces where experiences are shared and strategies debated. Through these institutions, individual insights coalesce into collective direction. Organization preserves memory of past struggles and transmits lessons to new participants. Without organization, consciousness dissipates. With it, consciousness consolidates into power. Revolutionary power does not mean spontaneous upheaval detached from material conditions. It means the capacity of a conscious class to reshape those conditions. When workers understand their indispensability to production, they comprehend their leverage. When they recognize that the state functions within a framework shaped by property relations, they question the neutrality of authority. When they see that wealth is collectively produced, they challenge private appropriation. Consciousness transforms perception of what is possible. Collective consciousness also alters moral imagination. Under capitalism, success is measured by individual accumulation. In a conscious class, value is redefined through solidarity. The welfare of one becomes linked to the welfare of all. Competition yields to cooperation. This shift undermines the ideological foundation of capitalism, which depends on isolating ambition. When workers prioritize shared liberation over personal advancement within the hierarchy, the logic of the system is destabilized. Historical transformations demonstrate the force of awakened classes. Movements that secured labor rights, reduced working hours, and expanded social protections did not emerge from isolated appeals, but from organized masses aware of common interests. Even limited reforms were concessions wrested from capital through collective pressure. These victories reveal that power lies not solely in ownership, but in coordinated action. Collective consciousness is revolutionary because it dissolves the illusion of inevitability. When workers perceive exploitation as unchangeable, domination persists unchallenged. When they understand it as historically produced, they recognize the possibility of historical change. The belief that another mode of production is conceivable weakens the ideological hold of the present order. Hope becomes grounded in material analysis rather than abstract desire. The process of awakening is uneven. Setbacks occur, divisions reappear. Yet each struggle leaves traces, memories of solidarity, experiences of empowerment. These accumulate, shaping future action. The class that once endured in silence begins to speak in unison. The individual voice joins a collective chorus. In that chorus resides a force capable of confronting entrenched power, of challenging property relations, of asserting that those who create the wealth of society possess the right to determine its distribution and direction. Organized workers possess a power that remains invisible only so long as it is uncoordinated. Individually, the worker appears dependent, replaced. Evil, constrained by wages and contracts. Collectively, the working class constitutes the living engine of society. Every factory that produces goods, every network that distributes resources, every service that sustains daily life depends upon labor. Without the continuous activity of workers, capital lies dormant. Machines do not operate themselves. Logistics do not arrange themselves. Profits do not generate themselves. Organization reveals this hidden centrality. Capitalism fragments workers by design. It assigns them different tasks, separates them across industries, stratifies them by income and status. This fragmentation obscures their shared relation to production. When workers remain divided, their bargaining power is minimal. An isolated individual who refuses unjust conditions can be dismissed and replaced. But when workers unite across departments, workplaces, and sectors, the calculus changes. A collective withdrawal of labor halts production. Profit ceases. The dependence of capital on labor becomes undeniable. Organization transforms numerical strength into social force. A mass of unconnected individuals is not yet a power. It becomes power through coordination, shared demands, and disciplined action. Trade unions, worker councils, and political movements provide the structure through which this coordination develops. Within such organizations, grievances are articulated collectively, strategies are debated, and solidarity is practiced. Organization converts scattered frustration into coherent resistance. Through organization, workers also cultivate leadership drawn from their own ranks. Instead of relying on representatives detached from their daily realities, they develop spokespeople accountable to the collective. This internal leadership strengthens autonomy. Decisions emerge from shared deliberation rather than external imposition. In this process, workers gain not only economic leverage, but political experience. They learn to negotiate, to plan, to sustain collective action over time. These capacities are foundations for broader social transformation. Strikes illustrate the transformative potential of organized labor. When workers cease production, they expose the vulnerability of capital. The interruption of profit forces negotiation. Even limited victories, higher wages, safer conditions, reduced hours demonstrate that collective action yields tangible results. Each successful struggle deepens confidence in unity. The recognition that change is possible erodes the aura of inevitability surrounding exploitation. Yet, organization can extend beyond economic demands. Workers encounter the interconnected nature of social issues. Housing costs, healthcare access, education, environmental degradation, all are linked to the priorities of capital accumulation. As awareness grows, organized labor may press for reforms that reshape public policy. Political mobilization becomes an extension of workplace solidarity. The line between economic and political struggle dissolves because both arise from the same class antagonism. Capital responds to organized workers with resistance. Employers may attempt to suppress unions, relocate production, or employ legal and ideological tactics to undermine solidarity. The state may intervene on behalf of property interests. These reactions confirm the significance of worker organization. If collective action were insignificant, it would not provoke such opposition. The struggle itself reveals the stakes. Organization also counters the ideological isolation imposed by capitalism. When workers meet, share experiences, and analyze conditions together, they discover the systemic character of their hardships. What once appeared as personal misfortune is recognized as structural exploitation. Solidarity replaces competition. This shift in consciousness strengthens resolve. Workers cease to see one another as rivals for scarce opportunities and begin to recognize common interests. Historically, organized labor has secured rights that once seemed unattainable: limits on working hours, prohibitions on child labor, social protections against unemployment and illness. These gains were not gifts from benevolent employers, they were concessions extracted through sustained pressure. They demonstrate that collective organization alters the distribution of power. Even within capitalism, organized workers reshape social reality. They compel recognition of labor's indispensability. The transformative potential of organization extends further. Capitalism is built upon the private ownership of collectively produced wealth. When workers understand their central role in production and organize accordingly, they confront the fundamental contradiction of the system. Why should those who create value lack control over its allocation? Why should decisions about technology, investment, and distribution rest in the hands of a minority? Organized labor raises these questions not as abstract philosophy, but as practical demands rooted in experience. In moments of heightened crisis, economic collapse, political instability, widespread inequality, the organizational strength of workers becomes decisive. If fragmented, they endure the consequences imposed by capital. If united, they can demand restructuring of economic relations. Collective organization makes conceivable the transition from a society governed by profit to one oriented toward human need. It equips workers with the discipline, solidarity, and strategic capacity necessary to challenge entrenched interests. Organized workers transform society by revealing their indispensability, by contesting exploitation through coordinated action, by reshaping laws and institutions through sustained pressure, by cultivating political consciousness grounded in shared experience, by asserting that production is a social activity whose benefits must correspond to its collective character. You were taught to dream small so that you would never discover how immense you truly are. You were trained to see yourself as an individual struggler in a vast and unchangeable world, rather than as a member of the very class that sustains that world. But history does not move by obedience. It moves by struggle. It moves when those who labor recognize their power, organize their strength, and refuse to accept limits imposed by those who profit from their submission. The system depends not only on your work, but on your resignation. It survives because you believe it is permanent. It prospers because you imagine your only path is personal escape rather than collective transformation. Yet every factory, every office, every network of production stands upon your effort. The wealth of society flows from your hands. When you understand this, not as an abstract idea, but as living truth, you begin to see that the chains are not unbreakable. They endure only because they are unchallenged. To dream beyond the narrow confines imposed upon you is already an act of defiance. To unite with others who share your condition is an act of power. To organize, to demand not crumbs, but control, not survival, but dignity. This is the beginning of transformation. The ruling class fears not your small ambitions, but your collective awakening. It fears the moment when workers cease competing and begin coordinating, when isolation gives way to solidarity, when resignation gives way to resolve. The future is not written by those who earn, but by those who act. And when the working class understands itself as the author of its own destiny, when it claims the right to shape the world it creates through its labor, then society itself must change. Not because change was granted from above, but because it was built from below.